This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Jack Wolf Knives Bionic Jack. And while this knife still has a lot of the things that make Jack Wolf knives great, it does end up feeling a little bit less special than its Slipjoint brothers. Now, I'm not here to waste your time, so let's get right into the background and specs. The Jack Wolf Knives Bionic Jack is part of Jack Wolf's more recent evolution beyond where they started, slip joints, into the world of modern locking folding knives. The Bionic here is an evolution of the Cyborg Jack. I've got a mini Cyborg here. I don't have a normal Cyborg. And this was one of Jack Wolf's more popular slip joint designs. It's also their one design that is truly novel, rather than an evolution of a traditional slip joint pattern. The Bionic Jack here was released in Cyborg Jack. I might have called this Bionic as well. The Bionic Jack here was released in 5 variants plus one blade show exclusive that came out later with a range of handle inlay materials and finishes. This one here is your basic utilitarian version with an acid wash titanium frame, a similarly acid wash S90V blade, because like most Chinese made companies, they have started to move over from M390 to S90V. And these really cool pink, almost slight hint of purple accents on the hardware throughout. And by the way, this one not just is a locking knife, but it also comes with a clip. This version of the Bionic Jack is a frame lock. All of the other variants are bolster locks like you see here on the Gunslinger Jack review coming up on this guy. But this is another one of Jack Wolf Knives locking, folding modern knives. And as you can see, that bolster lock, the inlay basically just covers what is essentially a frame lock. Other than that, your lock is quite similar. So, like all of Jack Wolf Knives, locking knives so far, every single time they've taken a slip joint knife and updated it as a locking knife, this one is slightly larger than its predecessor. Again, I don't have a normal Cyborg Jack. I've only got this mini Cyborg Jack, so the comparison won't be that useful. But the original Cyborg Jack was about 3 inches long. This one is about 3.28 inches long on the blade, 4.41 inches on the handle, and it weighs 3.2 ounces, so just a little under an ounce an inch. For a full titanium knife, that's not bad. The blade stock is the same as every Jack Wolf knife, which is 120 thousandths. That is about the same as a Spyderco Sage or a Chris Reeves Small Sabenza. And as with all Jack Wolf knives, the Bionic Jack here has their signature crazy thin hollow grind. It's a little bit harder to see with this acid stone wash, but this blade, when you pinch it, literally feels nearly paper thin behind the edge. On my calipers, I measure this between 15 and about 15 thousandths behind the edge, and this is my own edge, which is 17 degrees per side on a TS Prof Cadet. Now, all of Jack Wolf's knives, including this one, except for their, I guess, technically upcoming in terms of general release, even though it was at Blade Show, their fixed blade. Their new fixed blade is coming out is going to be made by LT Wright. That will be made in the US. Every other Jack Wolf is made in China. They don't disclose who their OEM is, but I have read more than a few rumors suggesting it's Reate. Given the level of fit and finish on here, given the fact that Reate has a somewhat unfortunate reputation for swearing their designers to secrecy, and given just a few things about the way this knife functions, the way this knife feels, I'm inclined to believe that this is in fact a Reate. But either way, Ben Belkin designs these knives in the USA, and they are then made overseas. The Bionic Jack retails for $350 across all variants. So whether you get, they have gold Kiranite, they have, all sorts of fancy stuff that you can get as your inlays here, as Jack Wolf typically does. They do not upcharge for that. This Stonewash full titanium frame lock version, or Stonewash acid wash, is the exact same price as any of the inlaid versions. And $350 is what any of Jack Wolf's locking folding knives will cost, which is $50 more than they charge for their slip joints. Now, a couple quick size comparisons here. We'll put this down at the bottom. Here it is compared to, actually we'll put it in the middle. Here it is compared to your PM2, so you can see about the same length, little shorter than the PM2 if we get them pivot to pivot. And here is your PM3. So you can actually see very similar in length to the PM3, Para 3. I always make that mistake, even though it is a much smaller knife overall. By the way, blade stock, check here. You can see how much thinner that stock is than the Para 3. Let's compare it to a large Sebenza here. Let's scooch this over. There is your large Sebenza, and here is your small Sebenza. So this is a knife that sits right in the, what everybody wants, the medium Sebenza size. This would be your medium Sebenza size right here. Next, let's do a Benchmade 940 right here. So very similar in size and overall profile to the 940. And there it is compared to your 945. Here is your TRM Neutron. I don't have my Atom with me right now. And then let's put another couple Jack Wolfs on the table here. Here is the Little Bro Jack. And here is their first ever model, the Sharpshooter Jack. And you can see again, these locking folding knives that Jack Wolf is putting out tend to be quite a bit larger than these Slipjoint knives, though you can also see that it is not a particularly large knife. And again, it's really when you turn it on its side, let me do it this way. If you compare this to, again, you know, the 940 is a pretty slim knife, but you can see, if anything, this is about as thick as your 940, which again, pretty slim knife. Compare it to something like a PM2, and you can see this is thinner stock and a slightly thinner knife overall than something like the PM2. So it's not a big knife. It's a relatively, you know, not a short knife, but it's not a big knife in any way. It's got that long, slim profile, which I really like in my knives. And the Bionic Jack has a lot going for it. First off, as with all Jack Wolf knives, the fit, finish, and the overall aesthetic design here are absolutely fantastic. So let's start with the blade here. This is a beautiful rendition of a clip point, and Ben Belkin sure does love his clip points. You've got a long, sweeping flat edge that curves up sharply toward the tip, a nice subtle swedge that tapers down toward that same tip, and really nice, clean lines everywhere. Ben always gets the little details right on his blade designs, like how the cutting edge of the knife and the spine sweep away from each other back here, how it widens up just a little bit, and that makes the whole blade look almost reptilian in a way. Definitely looks more organic. Your jimping here is nice and clean. The blade fuller here works great for opening. It is really just a simple knockdown fuller, but it works very well. Your blasted and tumbled finish, this is, I'm reviewing a lot of knives with this finish recently. This is kind of like your Hinderer working finish. It is very clean, consistent, and it matches the frame perfectly. I mean, there's a little shade variation, but it is not trivial to get, you know, your blade and your handle, because this is steel, this is titanium, to match this closely. And of course, you've got that Jack Wolf Knives hollow grind, which is a thing of beauty. This is a very aggressive hollow grind on thin blade stock. It's the sort of thing that I wish we saw much more on production folders. And it is, to me, the most remarkable thing about Jack Wolf knives is that they actually grind their knives aggressively. So end to end, which, by the way, that is particularly notable if, in fact, the OEM is Reate, because if you knew Reate a few years ago, Reate was notorious for having very fat grinds. So if Ben is getting them to make these paper-thin grinds here, awesome. End to end, this is a great-looking blade, and the execution at $300, it's as good as you're going to find on a production knife in this price range. The handle isn't quite as remarkable as the blade, but it is no well less executed. So the Cyborg and Bionic pattern, because they are the same pattern, this one's just bigger, it's this lovely mix of flats and curves. So at first glance, you see this big bend across the bottom of the knife and one more toward the butt. But as you look closer, you see that none of the lines on this knife are truly parallel. The knife actually narrows a little bit right behind the blade, then widens toward the middle here, and then widens a little bit further as you get toward the butt. In hand, it is a simple stick, but it's one that curves down into your palm here that gives you a nice satisfying hook down toward the bottom of your hand that keeps a narrow knife like this feeling nice and secure. I see an enormous amount of Chris Reeve influence in how Ben designs his knives. Some of the subtle things that make, here's my large Sebenza here, that make the Chris Reeve Sebenza pattern so visually interesting and so nice in the hand, like the variable bevels that are on the front and the tail here, like the opposing lines that look parallel but aren't quite in fact. All of those sort of subtle details are present here, and it really does elevate the design over a lot of other knives that lack that extra level of detail and thought. Now, on this version, you'll find a couple simple milling lines right here and here on otherwise unmarked frame. In other versions, these lines would mark where the inlays started. The entire frame is quite beautifully contoured. This is another way that the knife feels very Reate. Reate is really good. Let me fold this up. Reate is really good at these nice rounded handles where it's not a steep contour, but it is a very nice and consistent contour. It reminds me a lot of the K2 and a lot of their better design collaborations since then. The details are done right. This isn't such a severe contour. There we go. You can see it end on there. This isn't such a severe contour that the knife rolls around in your hand, but it's absolutely noticeable. And especially when paired with this sort of chalky acid wash finish, it makes this knife feel soft and comfortable on the hand in the way a stick of titanium kind of shouldn't. The pink accents may be an acquired taste for most, but they're done extremely well. So the color here is a Richard Rogers-esque magenta that stands out really nicely against that matte gray background. And crucially, all your hardware, if we zoom in here, including your backspacer here, which just looks so cool, and your clip and all your screws, had that same blasted finish as the frame. And by the way, this full-length backspacer here, they use to mimic something that looks like a backspring on a slip joint, even though this obviously doesn't have a backspring. And I will say, in person, these pink accents don't feel nearly as loud and eye-catching as you might expect them to. And honestly, it feels like a smart touch to take a knife that otherwise could be very monotonous and give it a spit of character. And everything just fits together quite so. At the blade here, these knives aren't fit together quite as tightly as the slip joints. If you look here, you've got no gaps whatsoever on the slip joints. You do have small gaps for bearings and things like that here. The gap between the back of the blade and the backspacer here isn't, completely invisible like on the slip joint here. But where's my, there we are. So yeah, you've got ever so slight gaps here between the blade and the frame, but there's no play. There hasn't been any play ever in this knife, and not in my other Jack Wolf knife locking knife. The lockup is solid. The screws may sit a little deeper in their, the screws may sit a little bit deeper into their sort of slots than I would like. And there might be some slightly unfinished chamfers, but honestly, I am really nitpicking, especially with a contoured frame like this. You really do need some custom level stuff to get, a screw to match this face perfectly when your whole frame is contoured. The jimping on the spine of the blade matches pretty perfectly onto the frame when it's open, and this blade has always been perfectly on center. I have never had to screw around with it. I can't find a single flaw anywhere on the fit and finish of this knife, and frankly, that's true for just about every Jack Wolf knife I've had. Their fit and finish has no issues ever, and it's really very, very good. So we got a beautiful knife here, and I would say it's almost as beautiful as Jack Wolf slip joints, though again, the need for bearings means they're not quite as extraordinarily tightly fit together. But in use, unfortunately, this knife is a bit more of a mixed bag, at least when compared to the high bar that Jack Wolf has set with their slip joints. So back to the blade. As you'd expect from a blade this thin behind the edge, it cuts well. I will say the factory edge wasn't quite as slicey as I expected, but the S90V sharpened up very well and seems to be heat treated very well. This knife does really bite when you get a good edge on it. And the blade stock is thin enough at 120 thousandths that even when you're dragging it through something like cardboard or even something tougher and more abrasive, that stock won't hold you back. But this blade shape, when it's been extended from 3 inches where it was originally designed out to 3.3 inches, does feel a little awkward. The tip out here is very high, and there isn't much belly. You've only really got a belly toward the front here and then a big flat. The blade looks beautiful, but for a lot of your day-to-day utility cuts, like breaking down cardboard or cutting tape or other small cutting tasks, that whole blade shape with how far this tip can feel a little, and how high that tip is, it can feel a little imprecise. And when you want to, try to cut something sort of down on a cutting board or something like that, it can actually feel downright clumsy because it's hard to find exactly where your edge is on this steep belly out at the front. Now, I've used this blade plenty. I've never quite gotten used to it. I have never really fallen in love with it. And, again, if I compare this to the 940 here, so very similar blade profile, very similar blade shape, but the way that the 940 has a more gradual belly at the front here, and really importantly, the way that the 940 has this lower tip, and just the way the blade extends out of the handle, makes this knife feel way more useful, way more natural to use than the Bionic Jack's belly here. It just has always felt a little awkward to use. The handle has sort of the same issue. The Cyborg Jack, this overall design, was actually one of my favorite Jack Wolf designs, both visually and in the hand. The way it curves down into the palm, and I'll bring the Mini out here, because the Mini is a fantastic small knife. The way it curves down into your palm, kind of like some of his other knives, like the Javelina and the Pioneer Jack, provides a very secure grip here. This little one is about as secure as a tiny knife like this is going to be because of the way this curves around your pinky. And that grip only gets better when you start to put the knife to work. But the curve on the Bionic Jack here is a little too long, a little too big, at least for my medium-sized hands. I want this curve on the bottom to really wrap around my ring finger and my pinky, but instead this joint kind of hangs out between my middle and ring fingers and even leaves a bit of a gap when I grip this. This gap just kind of hangs out in the middle of my grip here unless I really try to, crank down on it. Now, I can scooch my hand up a little bit to get my ring finger into that gap, but it just feels a little bit off. If you've got larger hands, your experience could be the exact opposite of mine. It could be great, but in my hands, the Bionic Jack feels less secure, less comfortable, and less natural in use than the slip joint design it came from. It's the same thing as the blade. It's a great design, but it could have benefited from a bit more of a redesign to grow up to this size. I think maybe either if this kink was more aggressive down toward the tail, or if the handle was a little bit wider overall, the ergonomics would have been better. And by no means are either the blade or the handle bad. They're still above average, even with my slight frustrations, but for me, they provide a lesser experience than I'm used to in his slip joints. It doesn't have anything to do with this being a frame lock. It doesn't have anything to do with it being a locking knife. It has everything to do with this design not working quite as well on a larger knife of any format. And so let's talk about that frame lock. It's fine. You might even call it very good. Whether or not this is a Reate action, meaning whether or not it's made by Reate, it feels like a Reate action. It's got that very smooth but very mechanical feel that's typical of Reate knives on bearings. It's a bit like a Shirogorov, maybe a little bit grittier than the sort of glass, and it's not quite like the glassy, super loose feel you get on a Grimsmo, or even like Best Tech. It's very, very clean, very consistent, just not quite as fast as some of those other makers choose to use. On the open, there is a light, crisp detent. You can either open the blade here by catching the fuller. It's hard for me to snap it out under the camera here, but you certainly can. You can even just, this hollow grind is steep enough, you can just jam your finger in there or even just pinch it out and roll it out just like that. You can also use the front flipper here, just like that. They all work as well, though I have used the front flipper the least. It slow rolls well, it flicks out well, and on the close, it's a nice smooth shake shut action. It's more drop shutty than I can show under the camera here just because I've got limited space. Again, this is smooth, not drop shutty. The detent brake here is a little late. If you look at where it gets up on the detent ball, it's a little later than I'd like all the way down here, but that feels like a nitpick. Your lockup is early and secure. Your lock bar tension is moderate, and the lock bar access is nicely chamfered and easy to get to. It's solid, but again, just like the shape of the frame and the blade, it just feels a little bit less special than its slip joint counterparts, which had that awesome walk and talk. So Jack Wolf made their name on three things. Fantastic packaging, which is still very much present here. I've got it all packed up, so I can't get it out right now. These field-leading hollow grinds, and a crisp, snappy walk and talk that's just as addictive as some of the best locking knife detents on the market. Here, with this frame lock, you don't get that remarkably crisp, snappy feel. Instead, you get a knife on bearings that is very good, but kind of indistinguishably good. It's no better or worse than a lot of other $350 frame locks on the market. From a utility perspective, a locking knife is simply better. It's just safer, it's easier to use one-handed, it's just a better knife design, but it's also a lot less interesting and a lot less fun than Jack Wolf's slip joints. And that's sort of where I end up with the Bionic Jack here. I'll reiterate one more time that this is still a very good knife and a very well-designed knife, with a level of fit and finish and thoughtful design that's a step or two above what most of the market is putting out between $300 and $400. But in every way that I compare it with the slip joint counterparts, and I'll bring out a couple here, this Bionic Jack feels just a little bit less comfortable, a little bit less natural, a little bit less fun, and a little bit less interesting. In the context of Jack Wolf knives and their overall brand portfolio, it's a great knife that makes a lot of sense, but strip away that context, and for all the benefits of its excellent construction and its remarkable grind, it's not a knife that's quite interesting enough or useful enough to stand on its own. If you love this knife, if you love this design, nothing in the way this knife is executed will disappoint you. And if you're a bigger guy that has found Jack Wolf slip joint knives too small, this might be right up your alley. But for me, it's just a little bit less compelling. This has been Clark the Knife. I'll see you on the next one.